First, a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming out this evening. This evening's McDonald Distinguished Lecture begins the 2022 conference of the McDonald Center for Theology, Ethics, and Public Life here at the University of Oxford. This year's conference theme is Faithful to the Call, Theological Ethics from the Ground Up. My name is Brian Williams, conference co-convener along with Matthew Anderson and the magnificent Ginny Dunn in the back. And on behalf of the McDonald Center, we want to say thank you to everybody who came this evening and extend our sincere gratitude to Dean Martin Percy and Christchurch for hosting the center and the conference, to Peter McDonald and the McDonald Agape Foundation for their support of the McDonald Center and this conference, and to Mark Levecki and Providence Magazine for sponsoring the receptions after our two evening lectures. Matt and I are both former DPhil students of Nigel Biggers, and organizing this conference is one small expression of our gratitude to him, certainly for his academic work, but perhaps more importantly for us, for his example of a faithful Christian scholar and academic, and his decades-long investment in students like Matt and I over the years, both professionally and personally.
Besides an opportunity to gather together some leading Christian ethicists and others, and to explore pressing questions together, the conference does mark the retirement of Professor Bigger after 15 years as Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology here at Christchurch in Oxford. In order to mark the occasion, we asked the current and most recent holder of the chair to deliver public lectures on consecutive nights of the conference. So this evening, we're delighted to hear from Professor Oliver O'Donovan, who held the chair from 1982 to 2006. He will be introduced by Professor Bigger, who has held the chair since 2007. Together, that represents 40 years of service to the Guild and the Church. Tomorrow night, those roles will be reversed, and we will hear from Professor Bigger, who will be introduced by Professor O'Donovan. After each lecture, we will have some time for questions and, of course, as noted earlier, a reception to follow in the courtyard. So we do warmly invite you to also attend tomorrow night's tomorrow night's lecture, also at 5 o'clock here in the lecture theater. Professor Bigger is good value, as they say, but it will also be his final official address as the chairholder. So we'll be delighted to hear that. With that, Professor Bigger, would you please come up and introduce Professor O'Donovan? Thank you.
He's good value, as they say. I'm chewing over that one. Our speaker this evening really probably doesn't need an introduction because Oliver is well and widely known, especially in these parts. But whether he needs one or not, he deserves one, and I will give it. Oliver O'Donovan is Professor Emeritus of Christian Ethics and Practical Theology at the University of Edinburgh and a Fellow of the British Academy. Before going to Edinburgh in 2006, he was my predecessor in the Regius Professorship of Moral and Pastoral Theology here at the University of Oxford, and he held that position for 1 year short of a quarter of a century, so my mere 15 years does not compare. During his tenure, Oliver established most of the infrastructure of Christian ethics in this country. He was at least among those who founded the Society for the Study of Christian Ethics in the early 1980s. Or Oliver, was it all you? Was it? You were among. Okay, that was my impression. He was also the founder editor of the journal Studies in Christian Ethics and the founder editor of the OUP series Oxford Studies in Theological Ethics. And all of this in addition to producing a body of published work that, in my opinion, establishes him as one of the best moral theologians of his generation and, frankly, probably the most sophisticated. and I've long said that he is one of a handful of best moral theologians that the Anglican world has ever produced. So we in the academic field of Christian ethics, and we from the Church of England and the Church beyond, we owe Oliver O'Donovan a very large and profound debt of gratitude. So it gives me no end of pleasure to welcome him back to Christ Church to deliver this evening's McDonald Distinguished Lecture under the pleasingly laconic title of Statues.
Among the cluster of contemporary moral enthusiasms that are either purging our civilization or threatening its downfall, depending on how you see them, the iconoclastic assault on statues occupies a minor but rather distinctive place. Iconoclasm draws our attention to how the usually abstract language of popular political morality, based almost solely on abstract nouns, may turn back to history, and especially to local history. So I've chosen this topic as a fitting way to express appreciation for the accomplishments of a moralist for whom ethics and history have always been closely associated, and incidentally one who has his own views on iconoclasm. Most elementarily, a statue is an object. In our ordinary comings and goings, we treat it as such. We weave our steps around it as we might a pond or a tree, and we sit on its plinth to eat our sandwiches. The philosophers declare that objects have the general quality of being disposable, which is to say, they are things we can do things to. We can put garlands round their necks, we can paint rude words on them, or we can pull them down. But that can is not a license to treat any object at whim, free of restraints or regulations. It leaves the question of what we ought and ought not to do with statues wide open. Some objects are living things, and the fact that they are alive is enough to impose restraints on what and how and when we can do certain things to them. Animals are slaughtered for meat, but we accept without question regulation of who may slaughter them, for what purposes, by what means, and in what conditions. Vegetable objects, too, enjoy moral protection, at least when they contribute to a landscape or to an ecology of public value. But statues are not alive, and so they do not benefit from that kind of protection. A few are singled out for recognition and protection as outstanding works of art, but we may be grateful that they are few, for we should never find room to preserve the millions of ephemeral artworks that are produced each year. So we might suppose that a statue of no special artistic merit could be removed without much conscientious anxiety, subject only to due public decision-making about the use of public spaces. But artistic quality is not the only ground on which objects of art may demand protection. Statues demand protection because they are public objects in a rather stronger sense than that of simply being in a public place and subject to public decision-making. Like public portraits or other memorials, they were clearly intended to have a certain durability. They would have no point if they did not survive at least the generation that put them up. They are, in some respect, like public buildings, designed to benefit the future by shaping its public environment. The buildings we inherit demonstrate the care that earlier generations had for us, anticipating the direction in which our needs would develop. When the Christchurch governing body of the 1960s decreed that this lecture hall should be raised, it was because they foresaw a certain need for public oral communication, hitherto, one suspects, unknown in Christchurch. Those anticipations could very easily go astray. The town I live in has a very handsome Guildhall and Linen Exchange, one building with two names, like the Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology, which has never, since the day it was opened, ever been used for its intended purpose. Yet it was not a complete mistake. The commercial life of a distressed high street still benefits from a distinguished building at its centre. Well, a statue is like a public building and unlike it at the same time. Where a public building cares primarily for utility, the care that statues exercise for us is pedagogical. Statues are speaking objects. They are memorials erected to ensure that we understand something. And what we are intended to understand is not information or even advice. Those who erected statues sought to impress certain values on us. More about that slippery term in a minute. And they sought to present themselves to us as those whose existence was shaped beneficially by those values. And they did that by commemorating a representative figure among their number who embodied those values rather strikingly. If the statue has something to say about military courage, commercial enterprise, or public benevolence, and the early modern Masons could be pretty effusive with their lettering, so we are never in much doubt about what they wanted to tell us. It intends that these lessons should be taught and learned through a particular human achievement of which that generation has been the privileged witness. So, if we ought to hesitate to pull down statues with the carelessness with which we root up flowers, it's surely because we sense an obligation to let them speak. An obligation that is in some way like that we owe to contemporaries who may wish to address us on matters of pressing concern to them. Yet it's no simple matter to bring the statue and its creators within the protection of the right of free speech. That right attaches essentially to the possibility of public speech, either the general possibility of certain views being expressed and heard, or the particular possibility of a given person receiving a hearing at a particular moment. The right of free speech, we feel, has been affronted if something that may be true, may possibly be true, cannot be said. Or if some speaker is so distrusted as not to be allowed to express a view in a forum where others do express their views. But in either case, the right extends only to what has not yet been spoken. Another indication, if one were needed, that the right of free speech is not an aboriginal natural right of all persons at all times, but a liberty that arises contextually in certain social conditions. And since no one has a right to hold the floor indefinitely, the context in which that liberty arises may be spent. Speeches are episodes of discourse which have their beginnings and their endings, after which the floor is given to someone else who may possibly reply to what was said, or may think the most fitting reply to ignore it. Some speeches last longer than others. Some are more fruitful than others in generating reflection. And if others ignore what we say as uninteresting or wrong, we have no reason to protest. That is simply the proof that any exercise of speech has to undergo. But a speaking object is open to the suspicion of trying to prolong its speech indefinitely. Socrates complained, perhaps humorously, of books that pompously repeat the same thing every time you read them and never answer the questions you put to them. Well, statues have been saying the same thing for a long time and in the same objective form. And if books, as a gracious Jewish tradition has held, may not be destroyed, but should be buried along with human remains, it is at least possible to ignore worthless books and to leave them to gather dust in the library stacks. So why should a statue have a right to spend eternity in prominence on its plinth? Well, the comparison with books brings us to the nub of the problem, I think. Books are designed, as the prophets of ancient Israel knew, to bear witness to history across history. It's one thing to deprecate the hasty publications of a pundit who has not submitted to the disciplines of Socratic cross-questioning. It's another thing altogether to insist that all communication must be contemporary communication. Many books, and instinct at least tells us that they are the most important, were written by those who have long since left this world and are in no position to answer questions. So the question then rises, what claim has a communication from the past? And here we may mention another feature of statues. They are not only objects, not only memorials, they are monuments, which is philologically the same thing as muniments or furnishings of a given place. Forms that confer identity on the place and the community that inhabits it. Places connect successive generations of inhabitants into one historical and political community. These connections have nothing whatever to do with biological descent, nothing even to do with continuity of linguistic culture. They are forged simply out of topological proximity, which is always a major determinant of political community. Monuments are means by which the political body, especially the civic body, recalls and sustains its identity through history. Past inhabitants provided the elementary furnishings for our present use. The roads and the streets, the dwellings, the markets in goods and labour. those who inhabit those conditions and avail themselves of them with more or less loud complaints of their inconvenience today, draw down on the resources of a political identity belonging precisely to that place. One means, among others, by which that inheritance is represented to us, the monument cares for the present generation of inhabitants by making them conscious of their political identity. And since the claim it asserts is a political claim, it's also a moral claim. It demands acknowledgement of predecessors who, which is very much like the acknowledgement that we owe to those who stand in some special relation to us, perhaps as family members or as neighbours. Since we are who we are in part by virtue of who they were, we must attend to them if we are to attend to ourselves. So it imposes the duty of memory and names forgetfulness as the easiest and the falsest form of social sin. Now, this claim, to which we commonly give the general name of tradition, is not merely a claim made by objects of historical interest. Among the many treasures of the remarkable library of this house, just 25 yards down in that way, are a set of musical scores written in the late 17th century by the Dean of the day, Henry Aldrich, who used skillfully week by week to adapt the great compositions of Tallis and Bird from a century earlier to suit the austere, vernacular, psalmodic requirements of Anglican worship in the reign of William and Mary. Now, these manuscripts give an unparalleled insight into the week-by-week provision of an unpretentious musical establishment at the time when Purcell and Blow were resplendent in the capital. Now, it's only a small sample, no doubt, of all that was in circulation at the time, ephemeral art, disposed of subsequently, for the most part, as having no lasting interest, which is precisely what makes it of great interest now, for it uncovers a social activity below the threshold of the conscious intention to leave something behind. If Purcell and Blow were the legacy of that age musically, Aldrich is simply the record of it, like a butcher's bill or a deed of sale, but uniquely capable of revealing some facet of ordinary day-to-day life. To discover the life of an earlier generation is, as such, an intellectual good. Only one good among many intellectual goods, and one might think not always the most urgent, yet enough to found a claim at least for the preservation of records. For a quarter of a millennium, Dean Aldrich's manuscripts have lain uncatalogued and unstudied in this house until this period. But the minimal duty of protection that an archive can supply was met. Well, this, we may say, is a kind of natural theological echo of the hope of resurrection, a belief in the communion of saints, a sense of the destiny of mankind to be in fellowship with itself across the generations. Now, tradition reaches across the generations quite differently from that. That is not an example of tradition. Tradition may or may not generate interesting historical records. It can very often generate rather uninteresting ones. There are, to be quite honest, too many dull statues, especially from the 18th century. As vehicles of tradition, they are thoroughly intentional. They assert what the past generation thought was important to bequeath. And that is what gives them their special claim on us. Historical records that survive their contemporary uses by some chance or other allow us to reconstruct the life of our predecessors in ways that catch our fancy or resonate with our contemporary interests. We may always simply use history as a mirror to reflect our own face back to us in, which is why historical drama is such a popular art form, especially on the television, since the characters wear quaint dress, handle old artifacts, and stand in front of ancient buildings while always speaking the language and the ideas of the 21st century, confirming our impression that the whole point of history was that we should end up exactly as we are today. Now, the monument stands in our way to block that self-flattering use of history. It takes control of the intergenerational conversation by addressing us directly on what mattered most to the self-definition of its own generation. Monuments have a mind of their own, about their own times, but therefore also about ours. So, how shall we describe what our predecessors most urgently wanted to tell us about themselves? We've said that they want to impress on us their values, concretely represented in particular achievements and personalities. And here is a word that requires much finesse. For most of my career, I have exercised the discreeter course of trying to avoid it. But values can have an intelligible sense, and it's sometimes important to be clear about just what it can mean, since it's still very current in the moral vernacular, where its vagueness is a fruitful source of moral confusion. So let me propose a stipulative definition. By values, we shall mean a specific perception or imagination of a complex of goods that is culturally formed and expressed in a given place and time. The values of the East may be said to be different from those of the West, the values of late modernity different from those of early modernity, and in such uses, values are both plural and subjective, as distinct from the good, which is objective and ultimately unitary, and demands the recognition of all cultures in all ages of history in some form. But there were two alternative interpretations of the word values that had currency in the 20th century, both of which differed in important ways from the definition I have just framed for you. The majority interpretation, originating with Nietzsche, understood values as posits of the will, creating the goods that they posited. So values are imposed on material objects as they are taken into projects of willing and acting. Those objects are then goods or valuable for us simply by virtue of our valuation of them. As projects of the will, values can be made and destroyed by new acts of will. And in a world where values are dead, which is to say, where what used to be willed is no longer willed, the cultural task is to will new values and create new goods, learning to love and praise new things. So far, very summarily, Nietzsche. Now, such a conception as that fitted very easily into economic ideas of value as relative to demand. The value of a house is formalized as the price someone's prepared to pay for it. So when Hannah Arendt says somewhere that the only imaginable value is an economic value, she means actually to dismiss the concept of value as unfit for serious moral or political use. And the philosophical consensus has, on the whole, not been favourable to Nietzsche's proposal for revaluation, even while it tended to accept his account of what values were. In objecting to the tyranny of values, Carl Schmitt had in view the tyranny of mass will, undirected, without rational basis. Jean-Yves Lacoste sees values as intrinsically linked to nihilism. For, as he writes, when we think in terms of values, devaluation can never be far away. Living for values meant being bound to moral fashions of the moment that had no claim or dignity other than that of the cultural moment or the consumerist appetite. But there was an alternative interpretation that gave values a much greater ontological dignity. And while it did not prevail against Nietzsche among the philosophers, it did have its own influence on the vernacular appeal of values in the 20th century. Max Scheler thought of values as objective realities attached to realities of other kinds, such as objects, relations, and persons. Values were not goods, for they could in fact be either good or evil. Nor were values and disvalues the good and the evil, for they were irreducibly plural, though arranged in an objective hierarchy of higher and lower. The task of moral decision in relation to values and disvalues, then, was ultimately describable as a task of choice, though choice had to be based on a correct relative valuation of higher and lower. There were many different types of value, Scheler thought, and with them many different types of personal worth that human lives could demonstrate. The values of the saint, of the intellectual genius, of the hero, of the leader, and of the artist. Each formed around different values, each giving the moral universe, altogether giving the moral universe an irreducibly plural character. And to this approach, I think, we owe the early 20th century's very strong belief in aesthetic values and its high view of the moral status of the artist. Now, if Nietzsche's moral universe could have no stability from one cultural moment to the next, Scheler's could only with the greatest difficulty be unified. So the theologian is likely to raise the objection to Scheler: there is none good but God alone. The unity of the good, the unity of meaning, the unity of God, these are the three unities that are inseparable for any kind of monotheism. Not only Nietzsche's subjective values, but Scheler's objective values too create problems for the coherence of the moral and intellectual life. Yet the theologian will have to confess that while the unity of the good may be the first word that has to be spoken about values, it cannot be the last word. If there is one good, one creator and sustainer of all things, there are also many goods, created and sustained. There is the good of colour, the good of thought, the good of forms of life. Changing experiences of the complex combinations of the goods that God has bestowed on us define the character of a historical cultural epoch. Epochs that supremely admired physical courage and facility, epochs that admired holiness and contemplation, epochs that admired artistic creativity, epochs that admired bureaucratic organization. Yet, through all these differences, the unity and the coherence of the forms of good must remain visible. And that is why, when past generations have witnessed, through their texts, their artifacts, and their memorials, to the values that they have recognized, they speak not only about themselves, but to us. They are well aware that their successors will not have the same values as they do, for they should know, if they think, that they will not have the same moral experience of life as they have had. They are also aware that they will need to be told of these values because they will belong to the same common moral universe under one God, and will inevitably be in search of a unified moral perception of God's working. So their care for their successors has this precise focus: to put within reach of their understanding a moral perspective that they cannot acquire for themselves directly, but can learn from. In this way, they express their hope for what may properly be called moral progress, which is an approach of human vision to the plenitude of goods in nature, life, and action as they are disclosed historically. If it's possible to think such an idea at all, then it is a human destiny that claims all ages and all cultures equally. Now, any voice that urges a genuinely alternative set of values on us makes some claim like this, even if it is not speaking out of the past. For if we recognize, as we must surely, that moral dissonance and disagreement arise not merely because of random wickednesses and stupidities, but can be structured by different experiences of the good available to different agents, then any moral disagreement is at the same time a challenge to enlarge our understandings. Yet, moral difference seems to be experienced much more radically across the generations than between contemporary cultures at a geographical distance. Perhaps contemporary cultures could be very remote at the time when Columbo first encountered the Native Americans or Marco Polo first met the Chinese. But the homogenizing power of modern technology means that in our times at least, while we harbour many disputed judgments and clashing interpretations, deep differences of principle only appear in glimpses through the cracks in a hegemonic ethos which unites the world globally, while any foray, even into the contemporary, comparatively recent past, reveals to us a world of values that is so alien that it can easily arouse a mixture of bewilderment and disapproval. If we wish to ponder the meaning of the statue as an initiative in intergenerational communication about values, two challenges have to be faced. First, the categories of difference or dissonance of value, when applied to moral perspectives, cover quite literally a multitude of sins. In moral matters, to disagree is to disapprove. That is the logic of moral evaluation. How then can we bring an open mind to moral values from the past which may demand simple rejection from us? Second question, How can such an engagement with other values have any hope of success when all the communication goes in one chronological direction, from the past to the future, and we're not able to speak to the people who put the statues up? Let's take these two in turn. The first challenge brings us back to the theological doctrine of original sin, which states simply that no moral learning or development begins from a tabula rasa. Every new moral discovery is at the same time an act of conversion, rejecting the sins and errors of the past. Moral wisdom is not accrued piece by piece, as one might learn Portuguese irregular verbs or whatever, one verb after another. It's fought for by struggle against an evil and a folly that always have right of possession. So we cannot simply represent moral engagements with the past through Gaudamer's famous metaphor as a fusion of horizons. As our moral knowledge is partial, so it is distorted, and therefore always, in a certain sense, a kind of misknowledge. And so may moral learning be. Alternative values, when and as we recognize them, may offer us new perspectives which we grasp eagerly. They may also tempt us to forget all our old perspectives. The encounter is therefore fraught with moral danger. To undertake it, we have to be conscious of the witness we owe to our moral experience in our culture in our day, as well as the witness we must receive from the moral experience of other cultures and other days. Dealing with history requires time, patience, and a clear head. To understand what is being said to us from the past, we have to understand something of its context. If the statue expatiates on the virtues of public benevolence, we must ask not only what form the benevolence took, but where the resources that made it possible derived from. Andrew Carnegie, who gave the town I live in most of the public buildings worth looking at, won his philanthropic standing through industrial practices that would be today wholly unacceptable. Somewhere in our gratitude to him, that negative judgment has to continue to find a place. But the context we have to understand is a many-layered one. The great mistake of so many unmaskers is to imagine that there is ever only one layer of mask that needs stripping away. We have to understand the constraints of past institutions, past public practices, past economies, and so on, and measure the freedom of action they allowed. When the captain of an 18th century slave hulk could boast that every cargo he transported reached its destination without loss of life, the boast was not worth nothing. In his course of life, such as it was, the only thing he had the freedom to decide about the slaves he carried was how to treat them safely. Judgments on the past may never be hasty. It takes a work of the imagination to get inside the history of a history. Yet, we may and must sometimes conclude that the past got something all wrong. Whether for reasons of culture, circumstance, or individual blindness, judgments were made that no human society ought to make or let pass. The early modern acceptance of the moral lawfulness of colonial slavery was surely an instance in which we're bound to say that. Yet even when we say it, we know there is more understanding to be gained. In dealing with the mistakes of the past, we have a very special privilege. We can seek to understand how they occurred without having to assume the responsibility for opposing them. Faced with a moral default in our own times, our reaction must in some measure be practical and immediate. To disagree is to disapprove, and our disapproval must seek to find practical expression, to stop the practice, to mitigate its ill effects, to make no concessions to it at least. But the past does not have to be stopped. It's done its worst. And so, in trying to interpret its mistake, we're free to recover the intended good behind the enacted evil, the moment of truth that brought about the centuries of error. And only when that is recovered do we know precisely where it went wrong. If we do not know that, we are committed forever to go on telling lies about it. The second challenge comes from the irreversibility of history. How can we give a negative answer to a value proposition from the past which has no ears to hear it? That is the puzzle the iconoclasts hope to resolve decisively by silencing the object that communicates the proposition. And in my view, the iconoclastic response is the only possible one unless we can envisage the discursive task of history not as a dialogue of the deaf, on one side at least, but as a multilateral debate which remains importantly open. Iconoclasm may be a reasonable reaction to a historical positivism that has maintained that since history is pure fact and nothing else, the only thing we can possibly do with it is to know it, and the pretense to pass any moral judgment on it is an irrelevant self-deception. In reply, the iconoclast answers perfectly reasonably that the statue on the plinth is not a fact of the past only, but also a fact of the present, which, like all present facts, is exposed to our practical judgment as to whether it shall be a future fact. Iconoclasm presumes a moral interest in history, and as such, it certainly has the advantage over a positivism that simply refuses to consider such a thing. Yet precisely for that reason, the iconoclast must hesitate before closing the moral reflection prematurely. Silencing the witness looks like a preemptive strike, which has no place in a serious moral inquiry. The past has had its turn, and we are free to answer it. Must there not then be scope for future generations to hear the whole exchange right through and form a judgment on it? The future has a claim to understand the past on its own terms, not only as filtered through the lens of our rejection of it. Even if our response to the past is decisively right and is going to be decisively upheld by future generations, the future must be able to decide that, not merely to be told by us that it is so. Once we accept that our revaluation of past values is not merely an imposition of our wills, but a genuine correction in the pursuit of a common goal of humankind, we may then surely find many ways to register our correction of past values. By written commentary, by giving public form to our own values in various ways, by new artworks, etc., etc. But that presupposes a hope for the moral direction of history through moral learning. The succession of generations, not merely as a succession, but as a real opportunity for children to learn from their parents. And such a process, while recurrent, does not have to be static. Children entrusted with wisdom that cost the parents years of experience to acquire can add to it the fruit of their own years and experience. Later generations may, not must, but may possibly be morally wiser than earlier generations. Such a hope is certainly contestable, and any evidence we offer for it is bound to be ambiguous. And yet, in any attempt to think through the ontological status of morality, that hope will persist in raising its head, and our theological traditions persist in nurturing it. So let us approach it from two theological points of reference. First, in a way that has a certain obviousness, from the promise of the kingdom of heaven. This positive hope for a historical completion allows us to conceive of a drawing near of the kingdom of God in the missionary progress of the gospel. As it follows from the spread of the gospel that the ethic of the gospel spreads with it, and as the gospel does not encounter an ethically unformed humanity, but existing traditions of moral reflection into which the gospel may penetrate, it is a short step to thinking in terms of an accrual of moral wisdom over the generations, and from there to thinking of the present as having a prescriptive claim to pronounce judgment on the past. But that conclusion threatens us with nonsense. The present has a monopoly of immediate experience. That is how it is distinguished from the past and the future, which are experienced only by reflective mediation through recollection or through anticipation. But the present has no monopoly of understanding in morality or anything else. To understand moral experience, it is not enough to have it. We have to allow the past to shed light on it, and if we are to make of it a practical understanding, we have to conceive an anticipation of the future on the basis of it. A lesson first taught us by Augustine, and often repeated, is that a present tense, isolated from its past and future, simply disappears into nothingness. The present, then, as a mere moment in the flow of time from past to future, can have no prescriptive point of view. And even if we try to reinsert that point of view into history by allowing for a future point of view that will pronounce on the present just as the present pronounces on the past, we are bound to fail, because that future point of view is not conceivable to us in a present that has set itself up as a favoured point of view on the past. So that whole train of thought has to be corrected with a second theological point of reference. And this is supplied by the understanding of original sin. In denying innocence, the doctrine of original sin asserts that the true character of moral learning is repentance. It warns us against dehistoricizing history, converting its novelty into process and its hope into predictive anticipation. It points to shame as the decisively historical factor in our moral learning. The moment at which we become aware of having lost the power to see and to do the good at some point in the past. The anger of the iconoclast can express the bitterness of shame. That shock with which a culture can wake up to the seductiveness with which the statues all around it have invited it to accept their values. The first response to shame, the instinctive one, is always to hide the obscenity and say nothing. The false value was expressed in an object, so let us de-objectify it. But that is a trap. Confronting the shame requires a critique that can articulate the truth that the shameful object has suppressed. Truths are aspects of reality, and reality must be spoken if it is to be communicated. And so, in the public exchange about values, it's necessary to look for some way forward from iconoclasm, a way that can turn the moment of rejection into a step of moral learning. We have our own artistic media, as I say. We use film with rather greater facility than we use stone. If we take up that task of articulating the debate seriously, then we have a hope of learning from the past we criticize. And only then can we take our predecessors seriously, not merely as shameful, which they may be, but as sinful, and can begin to ask whether and on what conditions the sinner can be justified. So to bring these 2 points of reference together, we must say, with the mainstream of Christian tradition, that the moral progress of history is an object of faith and not of sight. Moral consciousness may achieve a goal of unity and comprehensiveness. That is a hope we must entertain, and if we allow the term, it might be regarded as a proposition of natural theology. But that such a hope can actually become a reality is something we need to be told if we are ever to have confidence in it. I'm often associated with a claim I framed 40 years or so ago in the Southwest lodging here, that ethics needs to be evangelical. That is to say, founded on good news. Being told something salvific about history. So in my latter days, I've returned to that claim and repeat it. Only the prophetic promise of a plan for the fullness of time can make sense of these moral enthusiasms that rise up unbidden and then too easily can be lost in disillusion and disappointment. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor O'Donovan. That was a wonderful moment of communication, which can hardly be ignored and which I think shall prove fruitful through your questions. Note that I say questions, not speeches in response, but questions. So we do welcome those now. So if you do have one, just throw up your hand. I'll keep the queue as reasonably as I can. Professor Bigger, would you like to go first?
I thought I'd get in early. So Oliver, two brief questions. First of all, I puzzle over what motivates the current wave of iconoclasm. Curious to know what you think about that. What has given rise to it now? And then secondly, could you take your thought-provoking thoughts and tell us what you think about the proposal that David Hume's name should be removed from a certain building in Edinburgh because he expressed a racism which we abhor, and to leave the name there is in effect for us to endorse the racism. What do you think about that in light of what you've said?
The most I can say about the motivation of iconoclasm is that I think it's motivated by shame. Shame that is perfectly in place if we look back candidly over the history of the modern period of civilization, back, say, as far as the 16th century. Why shame strikes now and not 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that I do not know, and I suspect no general rule that would make that necessary or implied can possibly be formulated. So that is to say, I think that is a moment of historical awakening, and like all historical moments, it occurs when it does, out of the conditions that it occurs of, but not predictably. We may treat it, if you like, as a moment of grace, as well as a moment of threat, when some truth has dawned on us afresh, even if the expressions of it are not always the most appropriate ones. I think that's as much as I can say to that. As to removing David Hume's name from a building in Edinburgh, a tower, I believe, of peculiar ugliness, I'm inclined to think that our assessment of Hume is best expressed by that building being associated with it. I want to say that in the long-term vocation of humankind, David Hume's voice as a whole has its place. Precisely its place, no more than its place. And our answers to Hume on any front, including his remarks about the Americas and the colonial system, which were, after all, not what he was most interested in, and reflected merely commonplaces that you can find all over the place in that period, simply from people who wanted to show that they were being scientifically up to date, thought they were being scientifically up to date. We can reject those too. We are free to reject anything in him, thank God. And we should articulate that rejection clearly, precisely. We should also do him the justice of understanding that although he has this reputation of being a highly independent-minded thinker, which he often was, he also had his moments when he mouthed the truisms of the crowd. By treating these unfortunate observations as precisely that, mob truisms, and trying to understand them at that level.
That's good. Sir Matthews.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk, and it's a perfect thing both for Nigel's own concern with history over Hegel in some sense, and for the present moment, which seems, as you suggest, I think rightly, sadly confused and bewildered. I have 3 questions, and you can answer any of them as you see fit. First of all, I'm not sure if iconoclasm is the right context here. Iconoclasm seems to want to do away with images altogether. A lot of this, there's definitely a Jacobin element to this, where there's a kind of nihilism, but a lot of this is about adding, not necessarily all statues must fall, but recontextualizing some or creating a larger story, in which case, what do you think about that? Sometimes that might involve changing the statues themselves in some way. Secondly, the way in which we are thinking, and I think reflexively we should and have been taught to think maybe, about the we. It's not clear that a lot of the emotion driving this is shame, where people feel associated and convicted with these things, but anger at their previous masters who are still allowed sovereignty in these situations. And that's not just a racial thing, that can be a class-based thing. It's fascinating to think about Rhodes as an object of a kind of representative Englishman or something like that, or Thomas Jefferson as a representative American. These were fabulously wealthy people in this way. The third one, which might be more usefully chewy in some ways, is about the kingdom of heaven. Would you want to say that there's something potential, there's maybe a distinction between a Hegelian picture of that, where in some ways history comes to some kind of completion in some intelligible way, which almost sounds dangerously Hegelian to me, I don't know about that, versus a more eruptionist Augustinian picture where the final meaning of history is actually found not in the flesh, but in some sense also beyond the flesh in that way. But thank you, those are just 3 questions I had.
Very serious questions. I just take the third first, because it's just another form of the question, how well did Hegel understand the Gospels and the preaching of Christ? And the answer is always the same, Not very well, though he tried. But he made the promise of divine intervention and the completion of history into a kind of natural science that you could show the rules of. And that's, by definition, what it isn't. So, I mean, I think that's the distinction I want to make, and I think it's a very, very important one. The Christian understanding of history is not in that way reducible. It's founded in the will of God. As for, I mean, I gave my analysis in terms of shame largely on the basis of our British experience, not on the basis of American experience, which I always make a point of never commenting on. I leave that to those who understand it. Where the impetus to remove statues and so on is almost entirely driven by, one might say, the culturally enlightened circles of white community. Not wholly, but to a very considerable extent. And I'm interested in that. I mean, I think that is a phenomenon just worth looking at in its own terms. Why we feel, or some inheritors of white tradition feel so alienated from the tradition that they were brought up to in this respect. And there are good reasons. As I said, the experience of shame is often a dramatic one and destructive and includes a lot else. That I'm trying to understand the phenomenon of what's going on in Glasgow or wherever, rather than what might be happening the other side of the Atlantic. The first question you started with, I can't now remember. So, could I leave it with those two?
That's very good. There in the center.
Thank you, Professor. I was wondering if your model on iconoclasm applies to sacred objects and sacred statues, because you mentioned the Christian understanding of history, but we see in the 16th and 17th centuries huge swathes of iconoclasm against statues deemed sacred by Christians, not just because it offended them, but they would argue offended the will of God. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the whole term iconoclasm originates with, as it were, movements of passionate mob theological enthusiasm, and not only in the 16th century, but of course it goes back earlier than that too, back to particularly the East, with the 8th and 9th centuries, with the iconoclastic emperors in the Byzantine order and so on, where the reasons for demolishing statues had a strong theological strand to them, let us put it that way. Interpreting these events at this distance is always hard, and it requires a decent historian to do it, and I'm not that. But I take it that, particularly in the 16th century, this is not pure theology. This is also a strong cultural revulsion against a certain way of organizing the theologically based society that strikes people as enslaving. And the icon, the image, is one of the great living, vivid, objective reminders of this enslavement, which is experienced through priestcraft or whatever. However, you may, with whatever degree of Calvinism you may wish to express it. And in this sense, it was common to all the Protestant strands in different ways, including the Anglican strand. And I suppose what I want to say to it is that a theological concern needs to be reflective enough to reflect upon the real nature of that which it directs itself against. And if you protest by destroying objects. You are asserting something about the magic of the object, the power of the object, which in your better theological moments, you know it's precisely you're in tune to deny. And so iconoclasm always had a deep contradiction written into it in this respect, that it took terribly seriously these things which it said it didn't take seriously at all.
That's helpful. Yeah, just there on the end.
Thank you. For the record, I'd keep the plaque about David Hume as well, despite my disagreements with him. Professor, your analysis showed very well the multivalency of statues, that they say different things to different people at different times. And of course, those of us who work in ethics are familiar with the complexities that might introduce. But do you think we have any chance at all of being able to communicate that that to a wider, more popular audience? You've already alluded to that there is some cultural drive to the iconoclasm. Is there anything we can do to communicate some of these multi-layered issues?
Well, the more carefully we speak about it, the better. That's a start. I mean, I think there's a nearer and a further question that you're asking at the same time here. One is, do we live in an age when communication on any point of any seriousness or any complexity has any chance of getting anywhere? That I beg out of answering. I mean, I think that particular interpretation of our present situation has to be, well, anyone can take their chances in answering it as well as I can, I think. If there is communication possible, and our whole life as theologians and as moralists is sort of premised on the notion that this isn't entirely a waste of time, that there are people out there who can engage and want to engage intellectually with where we are in the world, then I think we have one point of hope on the iconoclasm issue, which is, although you can't make binding laws about history or reduce history to nature, there are certain binding laws that condition it, and one is that particular expenditures of energy are never indefinite. They come to an end. People get tired of doing certain things, and when they get tired, they are in a position to ask why they're doing them. There is a moment of opportunity very often when the first rush of an enthusiasm has expended itself, when we say, well, let's just try and see what this has achieved and what it hasn't. And I hope we're ready for that moment in this particular case, just as I hope we're ready for other moments of similar enthusiasms. Otherwise, you sometimes get another onrush of energy going in exactly the opposite direction, which will insist on putting all these statues back up again, including the ugly ones and the unpleasant ones. So I don't want that to happen.
Good, so we've got just a few more questions. So here on the end.
Okay. Oliver, you spoke about statues and a communication with the past. Just not a simple question, but one to think about the multivalency of the communication. Nigel and I share some background in the University of Leeds, where there is a wonderful Eric Gill relief commissioned by the city of Christ throwing out the money changers. And I don't think the city fathers recognised when they commissioned Gill to do it that many of them will be appearing in that relief. Who is the communication with? You've spoken in a way of it as a communication with a past culture in a rather general sense. There are commissioners, there are artists. It's convenient if there are words, but there may be many layers and levels to this, such that the complexity and the nuance is already present in the object. And I think you said a number of things that made life kind of more direct for the purpose of the lecture, but I wonder whether there's more to be said about that.
Thank you, Dr. Leal, for that absolutely appropriate qualification of the somewhat simple sketch I drew. I think that's absolutely right. The levels in which these things communicate vary from statue to statue. One may make generalizations. I had in mind some of the more obnoxious 18th century ones with very long inscriptions, which tiresomely detail the exact number of pounds, shillings and pence donated to orphans, and all that kind of thing, which have no intention of leaving anything implicit. But many communications are implicit. And reading the statue means reading the implicit as well as the explicit communications. I couldn't agree more. And the Gill example is a superb one, really, I think, for that.
And people need to be told it in order to read it.
Yes, yes, quite.
So the gentleman there in red.
Professor, thanks so much for the lecture. You referred many times, surprisingly, to the German context, to Arendt, to Nietzsche, to Schmidt. And as we know, Germans are world champions in coming to terms with the past. And important notion in that context is the notion of mourning. Mourning over statues, one might say, mourning over our past. So I was wondering whether there's a place for mourning in your vision of how we can come to terms with the past.
I think it's very helpful to point that out. Thank you. All those thinkers, all four, I also mentioned Scheler, all were engaged, one might say, in mourning, in one way or the other, for the German past. Regret for it, a love of it that was painfully critical, even coming from different angles. And this kind of commitment to our past, as one might lament the state that an absolutely disreputable uncle has come to. So disgraceful, and yet so dear to the family in its own way. It's important that we can claim the pasts we criticize if we are to have insight into them. Only if we lament their mistakes rightly. So long as we do the big sweep thing, we're not interested enough to mourn anything, I think. We are, as it were, using them as theatrical objects rather than as anything else. But I think the tone of mourning absolutely captures the way we have to learn to enter into the dark side of our histories and try to see what they were up to.
Good, just 2 seats down there.
Thank you. The pyramids of Egypt were built by thousands of slaves, many of whom died upon building the pyramids. The Parthenon of Athens was built by abusing the money of the alliance. One could extend the long list of monuments which have been monumental in Western culture and have been commissioned by kings and emperors that would be today qualified as despots or tyrants. So do you think that the values that such monuments like the Parthenon or the pyramids embody, do you think that these values convey truth? And if they do you think that the contextual setting in which these monuments were built obscures or shames that truth?
Yes, I think both those things. I think they convey partial truths. And partial truths are very ambiguous things because they are also partial errors. And very often, in order to focus on the partial truth they want to convey, they have blanked out their own context in ways that makes their self-representation to us looking at a distance look erroneous. What we have to see, I think, is how this dynamic happens. How eagerness to talk to us about the glory of Athens, let us say, for the Parthenon's sake, which is not a negligible topic of conversation in the 5th century. The glory of Athens is worth talking about, worth telling us about. We can accept all that. How this focus prevented a perspective on a range of other things that become very obvious at a greater distance. And all the time we are engaged in reinterpreting. That is not a purely relativistic account, as to suppose we can put on them any interpretation we wish. That would be nonsense. What we are doing is hearing what they have to say, but hearing it in a wider range of voices that also come through to us, and therefore locating it better. And it's necessary we should both listen carefully to what they meant to say, and also be able to stand back and pick up the environment in which they're saying it. It requires attention, it requires care, and it prevents us being hasty in our judgments, but I think the judgments are worth more when we reach them.
I've gotten about as deep in my queue as I'm going to be able to go, so we've got time for just one more question, and John has been...
Mine was answered.
Yours was answered, great, so we'll take Eric's then.
Mine was partially answered, so I'll ask it anyway. And it arises out of the American experience, contemporary American experience, so I'll disguise it as a question about Augustine instead. And really how, I may have missed this, when you invoked original sin, you claimed its denial leads to a dehistoricizing of history. But that's flipping on its head a common interpretation that invocations of original sin actually condemn us to a kind of, the character of our society is determined by its origins. And in the United States now, with the debates about originalism, but also debates about slavery, and a kind of Afro-pessimism as a philosophy that's sometimes been compared to an Augustinian account of original sin. Could you spell out how original sin helps actually historicize history rather than dehistoricize it, and give me some confidence how an Augustinian might think the civic body could be a community of memory with liturgies of lament that have this kind of, I don't want to say progressive, but capacity to remember well, as opposed to just the church as that community of memory. Those are kind of common threads in contemporary Christian ethics over the past 50 years. And as an Augustinian, how would you spell those out now? You don't have to give us a concrete example, but I was tempted by the German case or your invocation of film, of how this is done well in the civic body.
The latter part of that question, I think I have to leave to people with brighter ideas than myself, honestly. So let's concentrate on the earlier part, which is actually how this doctrine of original sin works. And the account I gave you of original sin was, if you wanted to label it, you could label it existentialist as opposed to, say, historicist. And I take it from my own understanding of original sin is precisely that this experience of origin is not just an experience or a recollection of past time, but is also an experience and recollection of self and past self. And that the agent who experiences shame, and Augustine's great virtue in expounding original sin, I think, was to focus on the phenomenon of shame, to ask us to think about it deeply. A phenomenon that gets no serious discussion in philosophy or theology otherwise in the ancient world, to the best of my knowledge, but is hugely important for Augustine. He has many misunderstandings of it, which is very easy to go through and just pick out, well, he misunderstood that, he misunderstood that, he misunderstood that. As so often with the great thinkers, the miracle was that he put himself in a position where he could make that misunderstanding when nobody else would even ask the question. You know, I mean, I think that's where we go to. And the discovery that my past, and that my can be a we if it's a collective agent, is vitiated by certain illusions that I'm having to be emancipated from. It seems to me that understanding is part of the understanding of agency, if it's fully developed. It's a practical understanding and one that allows a moral philosophy. Whereas a kind of determinist, historicist understanding of original sin, that because a certain man and a certain woman ate something X number of years ago, there is now no place for us to do anything about it, that is counter-agential. I mean, it has essentially ruled out our agency from consideration. Original sin is a discovery about our agency. That is what I think I want to retrieve from Augustine's great and disturbing thoughts on this topic.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Would you join me in thanking Professor O'Donovan?